Hi, I'm Vivienne. I thought blood meant unconditional love and support. Instead, when my tech startup failed and I lost everything, my parents cut me out of their lives like a diseased branch, telling their country club friends I was an embarrassment to the family name. What they didn't know was that I'd already been secretly recruited by their biggest client. 3 months later, when they walked into the boardroom for the most important meeting of their lives, I was sitting at the head of the table as their new CEO. Sometimes the daughter you throw away becomes the woman who holds your future in her hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me as I watched my father's face drain of color that Tuesday morning in September. There I was, 28 years old, wearing a custom Armani suit that cost more than his monthly mortgage payment, introducing myself as the new chief executive officer of Blackstone Industries, the company that controlled 60% of their business contracts. The same daughter they'd disowned 6 months earlier for being, quote, a financial failure was now literally their boss. But let me back up, because this story doesn't start in that pristine conference room with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Millhaven. It starts in the cramped studio apartment I'd been living in after my parents kicked me out, surviving on ramen noodles and stubbornness. While they told everyone I was taking time to find myself, instead of admitting they'd abandoned their only child. My name is Vivienne Catherine Ashford, though for the past 6 months I'd been going by Vivienne Kane, my grandmother's maiden name, because I was done carrying the weight of a family name that came with conditions. Growing up in the affluent suburb of Rosemere Heights, I was the golden child. Perfect grades, early admission to Stanford, a computer science degree that made my parents beam with pride at dinner parties. Our daughter, the tech genius, my mother Cordelia would say, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she gestured dramatically. Everything changed when I decided to leave my 6-figure job at Microsoft to start my own company. At first, they were supportive, excited even. Our entrepreneurial daughter became the new dinner party talking point. They even invested $50,000, treating it like a fun family adventure. My father, Harrison, would joke about becoming the father of the next Steve Jobs at his weekly golf games. The tech company, Neuralink Solutions, was my baby. We were developing artificial intelligence software for small businesses, revolutionary stuff that could automate customer service while maintaining human-like interactions. For 18 months, we were the darlings of the San Francisco tech scene. Featured in TechCrunch, invited to speak at conferences, courted by investors who threw around terms like, quote, unicorn potential and game-changing innovation. I was living in a beautiful loft in Soma, driving a Tesla, and dating a venture capitalist who took me to Michelin-starred restaurants, where a single meal cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. My parents couldn't have been prouder. They flew out for a product launch, posing for photos with Silicon Valley celebrities, my mother practically glowing as she told reporters that, quote, 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 innovation runs in the family. Then the market crashed. Not the whole market, just our little corner of it. A major competitor released similar software backed by Google's resources, undercutting our prices and making our 18 months of development essentially worthless overnight. 3 of our biggest clients pulled out within a week. Our lead investor got cold feet and withdrew funding. Our burn rate was astronomical, and suddenly we were hemorrhaging money faster than a sinking ship takes on water. I tried everything. Worked 20-hour days, mortgaged my apartment, maxed out every credit card I could get approved for. I sold my car, moved into a studio, and lived off energy drinks and determination. For 6 months, I fought to keep Neuralink alive, believing that one good meeting, one interested investor, one breakthrough could turn everything around. But sometimes belief isn't enough. The final blow came on a gray February morning when our last major client decided not to renew their contract. I stared at the termination email for 20 minutes, watching the cursor blink in the subject line like a dying heartbeat. That afternoon, I had to call my 12 employees into our conference room, a space that had once buzzed with excitement and possibility, and tell them I couldn't make payroll. Watching them pack their personal belongings from desks where they'd believed we were building the future together was harder than any breakup I'd ever endured. These weren't just employees. They were friends who'd believed in my vision enough to leave stable jobs and follow me into the unknown. And I'd failed them. The bankruptcy paperwork was filed on a Wednesday. By Friday, I was moving out of my studio apartment because I couldn't afford the rent. Everything I owned fit into 2 suitcases and a backpack, a humbling reminder of how quickly success can evaporate when you're building on borrowed time and other people's money. That's when I called my parents. I expected sympathy, maybe some tough love about picking myself up and trying again. What I got instead was a conversation that would redefine my understanding of conditional love forever. My mother answered the phone with her usual cheerful tone, but it turned arctic the moment I explained my situation. "Well, Vivienne," she said, her voice carrying that particular brand of disappointment that felt like a physical weight. "I suppose this is what happens when you get too big for your britches. Your father and I invested in you because we believed you were smarter than this." The word invested hit like a slap. Not supported, not believed in. Invested, as if their love had an expected return rate. The final conversation happened 3 days later in their pristine living room in Rosemere Heights, surrounded by the Persian rugs and oil paintings that had been the backdrop of my childhood. I sat on the same cream-colored sofa where I'd once done homework, where we'd opened Christmas presents, where they'd celebrated my college acceptance letter. But that day, it felt like sitting in a courtroom waiting for a verdict. My father didn't even look up from his newspaper when he delivered the words that would change everything. "We can't have you associated with our family right now, Vivienne. Your mother and I have worked too hard to build our reputation in this community, to have it tarnished by your financial irresponsibility." Financial irresponsibility. That's what they called my attempt to innovate, to create something meaningful, to take the kind of risks that had built every fortune worth having. "You're our daughter," I said quietly, still believing that blood meant something immutable, something that couldn't be dissolved by quarterly earnings reports or social embarrassment. "You were our daughter when you were successful," my mother replied, not even pausing in her arrangement of fresh orchids. "Right now, you're a liability we can't afford." And that was it. No dramatic shouting match, no tearful goodbye. Just a cold calculation that I no longer provided sufficient value to justify their investment in our relationship. They asked me to leave their house and not contact them until I'd gotten my life together in a way that wouldn't embarrass the family. I walked out of that house carrying nothing but my purse and a shattered understanding of what family actually meant to the people who'd raised me. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that failure had taught me something success never could: how to rebuild from nothing, how to be resourceful when resources were scarce, and how to recognize opportunity wearing the disguise of disaster. Because sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for the best thing that ever will. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Before we dive into how I went from sleeping on a friend's couch to signing my parents' paychecks, I want to hear from you. What's the most brutal thing a family member has ever said to you during your lowest moment? Drop a comment below and let me know, because I've learned that the people who are supposed to love us unconditionally are sometimes the first ones to abandon ship when the waters get rough. And here's what I want you to think about as we go through this story together. Have you ever been written off by someone who later regretted underestimating you? Because there's something deeply satisfying about proving wrong the people who counted you out, especially when they're forced to watch your success unfold right in front of their faces. I'm sharing this story not just because the ending is satisfying, though trust me, it absolutely is, but because I want every person who's ever been made to feel worthless by their own family to know that their judgment doesn't define your worth. Sometimes the people who claim to know you best are actually the ones who understand you least. So grab a coffee, settle in, and let me tell you about the most expensive lesson my parents ever learned about the difference between temporary failure and permanent character. Because this story is about more than just revenge. It's about what happens when you refuse to let other people's limitations become your own. Stay with me, because what happened next will make you believe in karma again. The Greyhound bus wheezed to a stop outside the station in downtown Millhaven at 3:42 a.m. on a Thursday morning in March. I stepped off into the kind of cold that cuts through your jacket and settles in your bones, carrying everything I owned in 2 beat-up suitcases and a backpack that had seen better decades. The station smelled like disinfectant and desperation, filled with the kind of people who travel by bus at ungodly hours. Night shift workers heading home, college students counting quarters for vending machine dinners, and the recently displaced like myself. Millhaven wasn't exactly where I'd planned to rebuild my life. It was a mid-sized city in the industrial heart of Ohio, the kind of place where steel mills once thrived and now corporate headquarters had sprouted up like mushrooms after rain. The downtown core was a strange mix of renovated warehouses, turned into luxury lofts and abandoned storefronts with soap-painted windows advertising spaces for rent. It was a city caught between its blue-collar past and its white-collar aspirations, much like I was caught between who I used to be and who I was becoming. I'd chosen Millhaven for one simple reason: it was 800 miles away from Rosemere Heights, and cheap enough that my remaining savings might last long enough for me to figure out my next move. My friend Rachel from college had moved here 2 years earlier for a marketing job and offered me her couch until I could get back on my feet. It's not glamorous, she'd warned me over the phone, but it's honest work and honest people. Sometimes that's exactly what you need. Rachel lived in a converted warehouse in the Arts District, a neighborhood that real estate developers were desperately trying to rebrand as up and coming, but still felt more like holding pattern. Her building had exposed brick walls, enormous windows, and the kind of industrial heating system that clanged like ghosts in chains every time it kicked on. Her apartment was a testament to creative budgeting. Furniture from Facebook Marketplace, art from local coffee shops, and the kind of cozy chaos that comes from making a real home on a nonprofit salary. "You look like hell," she said when she opened the door, but she said it with the kind of love that only comes from someone who's known you since you were 19 and thought you could change the world with a computer science degree and unlimited optimism. "I feel like hell," I admitted, dropping my suitcases in her living room and accepting the mug of coffee she pressed into my hands. It was the good stuff, locally roasted, fair trade, the kind of small luxury that Rachel prioritized even when her grocery budget was tight. For the first week, I barely left her apartment. I spent my days applying for jobs online, my laptop perched on her kitchen table while she was at work, sending out resume after resume into the digital void. Software engineer positions, project manager roles, anything remotely related to technology that might pay enough to cover rent and ramen noodles. The responses were brutal, when they came at all. Overqualified for some positions, underqualified for others. Too much of a risk because of the failed startup, not enough experience in the specific technologies they needed. The rejections felt like paper cuts, individually small, but collectively devastating. Each "thanks for your interest but" email was another reminder that I was no longer the golden child with the perfect trajectory. I was just another unemployed 28-year-old, with a gap in her resume and a story that started with promise and ended with bankruptcy. Rachel never made me feel like a burden, but I could see the way she calculated groceries, stretching her own budget to make sure there was always enough food for two. She'd leave little encouraging notes on the coffee maker, "Today's the day," or "Someone's going to be lucky to have you," and pretend not to notice when I spent entire afternoons staring at my laptop screen without typing a single word. The city outside Rachel's windows moved with a different rhythm than San Francisco or Rosemere Heights. People walked more slowly here, took time to hold doors for strangers, said good morning to the barista like they actually meant it. There was something both comforting and unsettling about the pace. Comforting because it felt human-sized after the relentless acceleration of startup culture. Unsettling because I wasn't sure I knew how to exist at a normal speed anymore. Downtown Millhaven was anchored by Pinnacle Plaza, a gleaming glass and steel complex that housed the headquarters of several major corporations. I'd walk past it during my daily job-hunting expeditions to the library, where the Wi-Fi was free and faster than Rachel's apartment connection, and marvel at how the building seemed to defy the Rust Belt stereotype of Ohio. This wasn't abandoned manufacturing. This was modern American capitalism in all its gleaming, climate-controlled glory. The most impressive tenant was Blackstone Industries, a conglomerate that had started as a small manufacturing company in the 1960s and had grown into a diversified empire spanning everything from aerospace components to renewable energy consulting. Their logo, a sleek black stone with a silver bee carved into it, was visible from 6 blocks away, mounted on the side of the building like a modern corporate coat of arms. I'd researched them during my job hunting, of course. They were one of the largest employers in the region, known for competitive salaries, and a corporate culture that valued innovation and results over politics and pedigree. Their CEO, Elena Vasquez, was a legend in business circles, a woman who'd worked her way up from an entry-level engineering position to running a Fortune 500 company by the time she was 45. The kind of success story that would have made my parents beam with pride if I'd been telling it about myself. But I wasn't. I was telling it about the woman whose company I walked past every day on my way to check my email at the public library, hoping for responses to job applications that felt increasingly desperate with each passing week. The weather in Millhaven that March was appropriately moody, gray skies that threatened snow but delivered only a persistent drizzle that made everything look like it was filmed through a dirty window. The kind of weather that matched my internal landscape perfectly. Not dramatic enough to be poetic, not sunny enough to be hopeful, just persistently dreary in a way that made you forget what optimism felt like. I established a routine to keep myself sane. Morning coffee with Rachel before she left for work. Job applications until lunch. A walk around downtown to stretch my legs and pretend I had somewhere important to be. Afternoon at the library, researching companies and sending follow-up emails. Evening helping Rachel cook dinner and pretending I wasn't counting every dollar I spent on groceries. It was during one of these afternoon library sessions that I first noticed the pattern. Blackstone Industries wasn't just a major employer in Millhaven. They were the major employer. Their fingerprints were on everything from the new sustainable housing development on the west side to the technology upgrade at the public school system. They sponsored the farmers market, funded the youth center, and had their name on half the charitable events listed in the local newspaper. This wasn't just a company that happened to be headquartered in Millhaven. This was a company that had made Millhaven their town, the kind of corporate citizenship that created genuine community impact rather than just tax write-offs and PR opportunities. And sitting in that library, surrounded by job seekers and college students and retirees reading newspapers, I started to wonder what it would be like to work for a company like that. A company that built things instead of just disrupting them. A company that seemed to understand that success meant more than just maximizing shareholder value. I had no idea that wondering would change everything. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was hunched over my laptop at Rachel's kitchen table, staring at another rejection email and wondering if I should start considering retail jobs. My phone buzzed with an unknown number, and I almost didn't answer. After weeks of automated calls about extending my car warranty and consolidating debt I didn't have, I'd developed a healthy skepticism about unexpected phone calls. Vivienne Kane? The voice was crisp, professional, with just a hint of a Boston accent. Speaking, I said, closing my laptop and giving the call my full attention. Anyone who used my new last name was worth listening to. This is Diana Torres from Blackstone Industries. I'm calling because your resume crossed my desk, and I'd like to discuss a potential opportunity with our company. I nearly dropped the phone. Blackstone Industries? I hadn't even applied there. Their job postings all required years of experience I didn't have, security clearances I'd never bothered to get, or advanced degrees in fields I'd never studied. "I'm sorry," I said carefully, "but I think there might be some mistake. I haven't submitted an application to Blackstone." Diana's laugh was warm, genuine. "No mistake. Someone forwarded your information to me with a very compelling recommendation. Are you available to come in for a conversation this afternoon?" This afternoon? In the corporate world I'd known, interviews were scheduled weeks out, preceded by phone screenings and portfolio reviews, and reference checks that took longer than some people's marriages. This felt almost too good to be true, which, in my recent experience, usually meant it was. "May I ask who provided the recommendation?" I said, my natural caution warring with desperate hope. "I'll explain everything when you come in. Can you be here at 2 o'clock? Pinnacle Plaza, 32nd floor. Ask for me at reception." I agreed, hung up, and immediately called Rachel at work. "Holy shit," she said when I explained the call. "Vivienne, do you know what this could mean? Blackstone doesn't just call people. They're the Google of Ohio. People move here specifically to try to get jobs there." "What if it's some kind of scam?" I said, pacing around her living room. "What if someone's trying to identity theft me or something?" "Identity theft you for what? Your negative net worth?" Rachel's voice was gentle but pointed. "Viv, you've been applying for jobs for 6 weeks. This is the first real bite you've gotten. Even if it doesn't work out, what do you have to lose?" She was right, of course. I had nothing to lose because I had nothing left to lose. My pride was already gone, my savings were nearly depleted, and my confidence had been beaten into submission by weeks of automated rejection emails. If this was a scam, at least it would be an interesting break from my routine of productive self-pity. I spent the morning trying to make myself look like someone worth hiring. My interview outfit was a black blazer I'd bought at a thrift store, paired with my one remaining pair of good pants, and the kind of determination that comes from having absolutely no backup plan. I practiced answers to standard interview questions while walking to downtown, my heels clicking against the sidewalk in what I hoped sounded like confidence rather than desperation. Pinnacle Plaza was even more impressive up close. The lobby was all marble and glass, with a security desk that looked like it belonged in a government building. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt endless, each floor number lighting up like a countdown to either salvation or humiliation. The Blackstone Industries reception area was everything I'd expected from a Fortune 500 company. Tasteful artwork, leather furniture, and the kind of hushed efficiency that suggested very important people were making very important decisions somewhere behind those frosted glass doors. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and kind eyes, smiled when I gave her my name. "Ms. Kane, Diana is expecting you. Can I get you anything while you wait? Coffee, water, a mild sedative for the nerves?" I laughed despite myself. "Just water, thanks." Diana Torres appeared 5 minutes later, and she was nothing like what I'd expected. Maybe 40 years old, with curly black hair barely contained by a professional bun, and the kind of energy that suggested she'd had 3 cups of coffee and was considering a 4th. She wore a navy suit that probably cost more than my rent, but she moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd earned her position rather than inherited it. "Vivienne, thank you for coming in on such short notice." Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine. "Let's go somewhere we can talk." She led me through a maze of cubicles and corner offices to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the entire city. From 32 floors up, Millhaven looked almost prosperous. The abandoned buildings were hidden by distance, and the new developments gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. "So," Diana said, settling into a chair across from me, "I suppose you're wondering how your resume ended up on my desk." The thought had crossed my mind. She opened a folder and pulled out a printed email. "This came to me last week from Elena Vasquez, our CEO. She'd been forwarded some articles about your company, Neuralink Solutions, and was impressed by the innovation behind your AI customer service platform. She asked me to track you down. My heart stopped. Elena Vasquez, the CEO of Blackstone Industries, had heard of my failed startup? I'm sorry, but Neuralink went bankrupt. The technology didn't work out commercially. Actually, Diana said, sliding another document across the table, our research team disagrees. They think your approach to natural language processing was about 2 years ahead of the market. The reason it failed wasn't because the technology was flawed, it was because the infrastructure wasn't ready for it yet. I stared at the document. It was a technical analysis of Neuralink's patents and published code, written by Blackstone's R&D department. They'd spent actual time and resources studying my work, and their conclusion was that I hadn't been wrong. I'd been early. Ms. Kane, Diana continued, we're not looking to hire you for an entry-level position. We're looking to hire you to lead our new artificial intelligence division. The salary is $250,000 annually, plus equity, plus a signing bonus that should cover your current financial situation. The number hit me like a physical blow. $250,000, more than I'd ever made, even during Neuralink's peak. More than my parents made combined in their comfortable suburban careers. Life-changing money. I don't understand, I said weakly. Why me? There are hundreds of AI researchers with more experience, better credentials. Better credentials, maybe, Diana said. But how many of them have actually built a company from the ground up? How many have taken an idea from concept to commercial product? How many understand not just the technology but the business challenges of implementing it? She leaned forward, her expression serious. Vivienne, we don't need another researcher. We need someone who can take bleeding-edge technology and turn it into practical solutions for real businesses. We need someone who's failed before and learned from it. We need you. The room was silent, except for the distant hum of traffic 32 floors below. My mind raced through the implications. This wasn't just a job, this was vindication. This was proof that everything I'd built at Neuralink hadn't been worthless after all. There's one more thing, Diana said, her tone shifting slightly. This position comes with significant autonomy, but you'd be reporting directly to Elena. She likes to be very hands-on with strategic initiatives. Are you comfortable with that level of executive attention? I thought about my parents, about their cold dismissal of my financial irresponsibility. I thought about sleeping on Rachel's couch and counting dollars at the grocery store. I thought about the months of rejection emails and the slow erosion of my confidence. Ms. Torres, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I've spent the last 6 months learning what rock bottom feels like. Being hands-on with a CEO who believes in my work sounds like paradise. Diana smiled. Excellent. When can you start? Yesterday, I said, and for the first time in months I meant it. As I signed the employment paperwork an hour later, I had no idea that this moment would eventually lead me back to my parents, not as their disappointed daughter begging for forgiveness, but as their new boss. All I knew was that someone had finally seen value in the wreckage of my previous life. Sometimes the best revenge is simply proving that the people who wrote you off were wrong about your worth. What Diana Torres didn't know when she offered me that life-changing position was the full scope of what my parents had put me through. Not just the disownment, but the years of conditional love that had led up to that final brutal conversation in their pristine living room. To understand why that job offer felt like more than just professional salvation, you need to understand the particular brand of emotional manipulation I'd endured growing up as the only child of Harrison and Cordelia Ashford. My parents weren't abusive in any traditional sense. They never hit me, never screamed, never locked me in closets or withheld food. Instead, they perfected a more sophisticated form of control, making their love contingent on my performance, my achievements, my ability to enhance their social standing in the rarefied air of Rosemere Heights society. From the time I could walk, every aspect of my life was carefully curated to reflect well on the family brand. Piano lessons at 4, not because I showed musical aptitude, but because cultured families have musical children. Tennis at the country club at 6, not because I enjoyed sports, but because athletic children photograph well for the club newsletter. Advanced math camps during summers, not because I loved numbers, but because gifted children make gifted parents look gifted too. I learned early that my worth was measured in external validation. When I brought home straight A's, my mother would display my report card on the refrigerator like a trophy and mention my academic performance to anyone who would listen. When I won the regional science fair in 8th grade, my father bought a bigger house, literally, because successful families need homes that reflect their status. But the flip side of conditional love is conditional disappointment, and I learned that lesson just as thoroughly. When I got a B+ in advanced chemistry junior year, the silent treatment lasted for 3 days. When I chose Stanford over Harvard, because Stanford had a better computer science program, my mother spent 6 months telling anyone who would listen that I'd made a creative choice, rather than admit I'd been waitlisted at her preferred Ivy League school. The pattern was always the same. My successes belonged to them, my failures belonged to me. When I graduated summa cum laude, they threw a party and invited half of Rosemere Heights to celebrate their achievement. When I struggled with depression during my senior year and needed therapy, they quietly paid for it while making sure none of their friends knew their perfect daughter was, quote, having emotional problems. Money was their primary language of affection, but it came with strings attached that could strangle you if you weren't careful. They paid my college tuition and reminded me of their generosity every time I made a decision they disagreed with. They bought me a car for graduation and used it as leverage when I considered taking a job in Seattle instead of San Francisco. They helped with the down payment on my first apartment and felt entitled to opinions about my decorating choices, my boyfriend, and my weekend plans. When I left Microsoft to start Neuralink, their initial enthusiasm wasn't about supporting my entrepreneurial dreams. It was about being able to say their daughter was a tech founder. They loved telling their country club friends about my venture capital meetings and product launches, treating my startup like an extension of their own success story. My mother had business cards printed that said Cordelia Ashford, mother of tech entrepreneur, which should have been my first red flag that they viewed my career as a subsidiary of their social brand. The $50,000 they invested wasn't a gift or even a loan in any traditional sense. It was a purchase of ownership rights to my narrative. They expected regular updates, insisted on being copied on important emails, and made it clear that they considered themselves silent partners in my success. When TechCrunch featured Neuralink in their Hot Startups to Watch series, my father had the article framed in his office and told colleagues he was involved in the next big thing. But the most insidious part of their conditional love was how thoroughly it had trained me to measure my own worth through their approval. Even as an adult, even running my own company, some part of me was still that little girl arranging achievements like offerings on an altar, hoping to earn the kind of unconditional acceptance that other families seem to give freely. I remember the exact moment I realized how twisted our dynamic had become. It was during Neuralink's darkest period, when we were hemorrhaging money and I was working 100-hour weeks trying to save the company. I called my mother from my office at 2 a.m., exhausted and scared, looking for emotional support from the woman who'd raised me. "Mom," I said, my voice cracking with fatigue and fear, "I think the company might not make it. I'm scared I'm going to lose everything." There was a long pause before she responded, and when she did, her voice carried that familiar tone of disappointment I'd been trained to dread. "Well, Vivienne, perhaps this is a sign that you should have listened when your father and I suggested you take that stable position at Google instead of chasing these fantasies." Not "I'm sorry you're struggling," not "is there anything we can do to help," not even "these things happen, sweetheart." Just immediate judgment and a reminder that they'd been skeptical of my choices all along. That phone call encapsulated everything toxic about our relationship. My vulnerability was met with criticism, my fear was met with smugness, and my need for comfort was met with a lecture about how I should have made different choices. It was conditional love in its purest, most brutal form. When Neuralink finally collapsed, I'd already been emotionally prepared for their abandonment, because I'd lived my entire life understanding that their affection was transactional. What I hadn't been prepared for was the surgical precision with which they'd cut me out of their lives, not with anger or drama, but with the cold efficiency of a corporation divesting from an underperforming asset. The conversation in their living room wasn't really about my financial situation or their reputation in the community. It was the logical conclusion of 28 years of conditional love finally reaching its condition. I was no longer worth the investment. But here's what they never understood about the daughter they'd raised to be their reflection. All those years of performance-based affection had taught me something valuable about resilience. When your love has always been contingent on achievement, failure doesn't devastate you, it motivates you. When your worth has always been tied to external validation, losing that validation doesn't destroy your sense of self. It forces you to build a new one. They'd trained me to be a high achiever, to be strategic, to understand the correlation between effort and reward. They'd taught me to be charming with adults, professional in my presentation, and relentlessly focused on results. They'd given me the tools to succeed in corporate America, even if they'd failed to give me the emotional foundation to feel secure in their love. Most importantly, they taught me to recognize conditional relationships for what they were, business transactions dressed up as family bonds. That recognition would serve me well in the corporate world, where at least the conditions were explicit and the rewards were clearly defined. As I sat in Diana Torres's office, signing paperwork that would triple my previous highest salary, I realized that my parents had inadvertently prepared me for this moment. Not because they'd loved me unconditionally, but because they'd taught me to thrive under conditional circumstances. They'd raised me to be successful, strategic, and emotionally self-sufficient. They just never imagined those qualities would eventually be turned against them. The irony was perfect. The daughter they'd molded to enhance their social status was about to become more successful than they'd ever dreamed, and they'd forfeited any right to claim credit for it the moment they decided I was more liability than asset. Sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming everything your critics said you couldn't be, especially when those critics helped create the very skills that made your success possible. The moment everything crystallized for me wasn't when Diana made the job offer, or even when I signed the contract. It happened 3 weeks into my new position at Blackstone, during what should have been a routine strategy meeting, when I discovered exactly why Elena Vasquez had been so determined to hire me. I was sitting in Elena's corner office on the 35th floor, surrounded by awards, industry recognitions, and photographs of her shaking hands with presidents and prime ministers. The afternoon sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast everything in golden light, making the whole scene feel almost surreal. Elena herself was reviewing quarterly reports while I presented my initial assessment of Blackstone's AI capabilities, when she suddenly looked up and asked a question that changed everything. "Vivienne," she said, setting down her pen and giving me her full attention, "what do you know about Ashford Strategic Consulting?" The name hit me like ice water in my veins. Ashford Strategic Consulting was my parents' firm, the boutique business consultancy they'd built over the past 15 years into one of the most prestigious operations in the Midwest. My father Harrison specialized in organizational restructuring, while my mother Cordelia handled client relations and business development. It was their pride and joy, their claim to fame in Rosemere Heights society, and the source of the comfortable lifestyle that had made them feel entitled to judge my, quote, financial irresponsibility. "I'm familiar with them," I said carefully, hoping my voice didn't betray the way my heart had started hammering against my ribs. Elena's smile was sharp, predatory. "I'm sure you are. They're one of our primary consulting vendors. Have been for about 3 years now. They handle our organizational efficiency audits, help us streamline operations, that sort of thing. Very expensive, very exclusive. They like to remind us how lucky we are to have secured their services." The world tilted slightly on its axis. My parents worked for Blackstone Industries. The company that had just hired me to run their AI division was the same company that provided 60% of my parents' annual revenue. The same company where I now held a senior executive position. Interesting, I managed, though the word felt like sawdust in my mouth. What's even more interesting, Elena continued, pulling a file from her drawer, is that Harrison and Cordelia Ashford have been very vocal about their daughter, the failed entrepreneur. They've mentioned several times during client dinners how disappointed they are in their daughter's poor business judgment and financial irresponsibility. Apparently, she was an embarrassment to the family name. My face burned with humiliation. They'd been discussing my failures with their biggest client, not just acknowledging them, but using them as conversation topics, turning my pain into networking small talk. Elena's expression softened slightly. Vivienne, I need you to understand something. When I first heard your name mentioned in passing during one of those dinners, I was curious enough to research you myself. And what I found was remarkable. Not a failed entrepreneur, but a visionary who'd been ahead of her time. Someone who'd built something extraordinary and had the courage to take risks that most people wouldn't even consider. She leaned forward, her voice taking on an intensity that made me sit up straighter. Your parents have been telling anyone who would listen that you're a failure, a disappointment, a cautionary tale about what happens when children don't listen to their parents' wisdom. But I looked at your work, your patents, your published research, and I saw something completely different. I saw someone I wanted working for me. The realization hit me like a freight train. Elena hadn't hired me despite my parents' opinions. She'd hired me because of them. Their attempts to diminish me had actually drawn attention to my achievements. Their public shaming had inadvertently led to my professional salvation. There's something else you should know, Elena said, her tone becoming almost conversational. Ashford Strategic Consulting's contract with us comes up for renewal in 6 months. Given the direction we're taking the company, with increased focus on technological innovation and AI integration, we'll be looking for consultants who understand the modern business landscape, not just traditional organizational structures. The implication hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon. My parents' most important client, the foundation of their financial stability and social status, was quietly questioning whether their services would still be relevant in a technology-driven future. And I would be one of the executives making that determination. Elena, I said slowly, are you telling me that my parents' professional future depends partially on decisions that I'll be involved in making? Her smile was enigmatic. I'm telling you that merit and results matter more than family connections in my company. Your parents have been coasting on their reputation for a while now. Their strategies are becoming outdated, their approach is increasingly rigid, and frankly, their attitude toward innovation, particularly technological innovation, is problematic for a company like ours. I felt something shifting inside me, like tectonic plates realigning after years of pressure. For months, I'd been the family failure, the cautionary tale, the daughter who'd brought shame to the Ashford name. But sitting in that office, listening to Elena describe my parents' vulnerabilities, I realized that the power dynamic I'd always assumed was actually far more complex than I'd understood. Elena, I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected, hypothetically speaking, if Ashford Strategic Consulting's performance doesn't meet Blackstone's evolving needs, what would happen to their contract? Hypothetically, Elena's eyes gleamed. We'd terminate the relationship and find consultants who better align with our strategic vision. Business is business, Vivienne. Sentiment doesn't pay dividends. The conversation continued for another hour, covering quarterly projections and technology roadmaps, but my mind was elsewhere. I was processing the staggering irony of my situation. The parents who'd disowned me for being a business failure were now professionally dependent on the company that had recognized my business potential. They'd spent years making their love contingent on my success, and now my success would determine their professional survival. Walking back to my office after that meeting, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: power. Not the desperate, scrappy determination of someone fighting to survive, but the calm, strategic power of someone who held all the cards and had time to decide how to play them. My parents had taught me that relationships were transactional, that love was conditional, that worth was measured in professional achievement and financial success. They'd raised me to understand that in their world, business always came before sentiment. Now I was in a position to apply those lessons. For the first time since they'd kicked me out of their house, I wasn't thinking about earning their forgiveness or proving my worth to them. I was thinking about something much more satisfying, making them understand exactly what they'd lost when they decided I wasn't worth keeping. The daughter they'd dismissed as a failure was now in a position to determine whether their consulting firm would survive Blackstone's next strategic review. The child they'd said was too big for her britches was now wearing a $200,000 salary and had the ear of one of the most powerful CEOs in the Midwest. They'd wanted a daughter who enhanced their reputation and contributed to their success. They'd gotten one. They just hadn't realized it until it was too late to benefit from it. As I settled into my desk that afternoon, beginning work on the AI integration strategy that would reshape Blackstone's operational efficiency, I allowed myself a small smile. My parents had always said that family was about loyalty, about supporting each other through difficult times. Soon, they'd have the opportunity to learn just how conditional that support could be. The next morning, I walked into Blackstone Industries with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Not the desperate clarity of someone trying to survive, but the cold, calculated clarity of someone who finally understood the game and held a winning hand. I had 6 months until my parents' contract renewal, and I intended to use every single day strategically. My first move was research. If I was going to outmaneuver Harrison and Cordelia Ashford professionally, I needed to understand their operation better than they understood it themselves. I spent my lunch breaks in the company archives, pulling every report Ashford Strategic Consulting had delivered to Blackstone over the past 3 years. Every efficiency audit, every organizational restructuring proposal, every client recommendation they'd made while collecting their substantial consulting fees. What I found was both revealing and pathetic. Their work wasn't terrible, but it was fundamentally outdated. The kind of management consulting that had been cutting edge in 1995, but looked increasingly irrelevant in an era of rapid technological change. They approached every problem with the same cookie-cutter solutions: flatten organizational hierarchies, eliminate redundant positions, implement standardized processes. Classic business school methodology that completely ignored the realities of modern innovation cycles and agile development. More damaging was their complete inability to understand technology integration. In their reports, they consistently recommended against investments in AI, automation, and digital transformation, describing them as expensive distractions from core business competencies. They'd actually advised Blackstone to reduce their technology budget and focus on, quote, proven traditional methods of operational efficiency. Elena had been politely ignoring their recommendations for 2 years. Armed with this knowledge, I began crafting my counter-strategy. Instead of attacking my parents directly, which would have been emotionally satisfying but professionally stupid, I decided to make their irrelevance impossible to ignore. I would build something so innovative, so obviously valuable, that it would highlight the fundamental inadequacy of their traditional approach. My AI integration proposal became my weapon. Working 12-hour days, I developed a comprehensive plan for implementing artificial intelligence across Blackstone's operations. Not just the flashy, headline-grabbing applications that tech companies used for marketing purposes, but practical, profit-generating solutions that would revolutionize how the company operated. Predictive maintenance algorithms that could prevent equipment failures before they happened. Customer service AI that could handle complex inquiries with human-level empathy. Supply chain optimization models that could reduce costs by 15% while improving delivery times. Every solution was backed by detailed financial projections, implementation timelines, and risk assessments. I brought in external consultants to validate my numbers, commissioned pilot studies to prove concept viability, and built partnerships with technology vendors who could guarantee results. By the time I was finished, I had a 200-page proposal that represented the most comprehensive technological transformation plan in Blackstone's history. But the real genius wasn't in the technology, it was in the narrative. Throughout the proposal, I made careful, subtle references to outdated consulting methodologies and the limitations of traditional efficiency approaches. I included case studies of companies that had failed because they'd listened to consultants who discouraged technological innovation. I built a compelling argument that the future belonged to organizations brave enough to embrace change, not cling to familiar but obsolete strategies. I never mentioned Ashford Strategic Consulting by name. I didn't need to. Elena read the proposal over a long weekend and called me into her office first thing Monday morning. Her enthusiasm was electric. "Vivienne, this is extraordinary work. If we implement even half of these recommendations, we'll be 5 years ahead of our competitors." She flipped through the bound document, nodding at sections she'd highlighted. "The financial projections alone are compelling enough to justify the investment, but the strategic positioning this gives us is invaluable." "Thank you," I said, maintaining professional composure while internally celebrating. I believe technology integration isn't just about efficiency, it's about fundamental competitive advantage. Agreed completely. Elena set the proposal down and fixed me with that sharp look I was learning to recognize. "I want to fast-track this. How quickly can we begin implementation?" "The pilot programs could launch within 60 days, I said. "Full implementation would take 18 months, but we'd see measurable results within the first quarter." Elena's smile was predatory. "Excellent. I'm scheduling a board presentation for next month. I want you to present this personally to our executive team and key stakeholders." Key stakeholders. The phrase hung in the air like a promise. At Blackstone, key stakeholders included major consulting vendors, particularly those whose contracts were coming up for renewal. "Of course," I said. "Should I prepare for any specific questions or concerns?" "Oh, I'm sure there will be plenty of questions," Elena said, her tone suggesting she was looking forward to them, particularly from our traditional consulting partners. They might feel that technological solutions threaten their established methodologies. 2 weeks later, I stood in Blackstone's main conference room, facing a table of executives, board members, and consulting partners. The presentation setup was perfect. A massive screen displaying my AI integration roadmap, detailed financial projections showing millions in potential savings, and a room full of people who understood that technological innovation wasn't optional anymore. Harrison and Cordelia sat at the far end of the table, dressed in their usual expensive business attire, looking every inch the successful consultants they'd always presented themselves as. They had no idea their daughter was about to systematically dismantle their professional relevance. My presentation was flawless. 18 months of humiliation, 6 months of strategic planning, and 3 weeks of meticulous preparation had led to this moment. I walked them through each component of the AI integration plan, demonstrating not just what was possible, but what was inevitable. Companies that embraced these technologies would thrive. Companies that didn't would become irrelevant. During the Q&A session, my father raised his hand. "Miss Kane," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of condescending authority. "While these technological solutions sound impressive in theory, don't you think there's value in proven, traditional approaches to business efficiency? Sometimes the old ways work best." The irony of him calling me Miss Kane, not recognizing that his own daughter was presenting under her grandmother's maiden name, would have been funny if it hadn't been so perfectly symbolic of how little attention he'd ever paid to who I actually was. "Mr. Ashford," I replied, my voice steady and professional, "I appreciate the question. Traditional approaches certainly have their place in business history. However, companies that prioritize familiarity over innovation typically find themselves disrupted by competitors who aren't bound by conventional thinking." I clicked to my next slide, a graph showing the decline of consulting firms that had failed to adapt to technological change. The business landscape rewards adaptation, not tradition. Companies need consultants who understand emerging technologies, not just established processes. The room was silent. Elena's expression was carefully neutral, but I caught the slight nod of approval. Other board members were taking notes, asking follow-up questions about implementation timelines and budget allocations. My parents, meanwhile, looked increasingly uncomfortable as the presentation continued. Every technology solution I proposed was an implicit criticism of their analog approach to business consulting. Every innovation I suggested highlighted their failure to evolve with changing market demands. By the time I finished, it was clear that the room had moved decisively toward technological transformation. The board approved the AI integration plan unanimously, with Elena authorized to begin implementation immediately. As the meeting dispersed, I gathered my materials and headed toward the door. My mother caught up with me in the hallway, her expression confused and slightly desperate. "Excuse me, Miss Kane," she said, her voice carrying a tremor I'd never heard before. "I wanted to discuss how our firms might collaborate on this initiative. Ashford Strategic Consulting has extensive experience with organizational change management." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in 6 months. She was still polished, still projecting confidence, but there was something brittle around the edges now. Fear, maybe, or the beginning of understanding that the world was changing faster than she could adapt. "Mrs. Ashford," I said politely, "I appreciate your interest. However, this project requires consultants with specific technological expertise. I'm sure you understand." The dismissal was gentle but absolute, professional rather than personal. Exactly the kind of cold, business-focused decision they'd taught me to make. I walked away without looking back, leaving my mother standing in that hallway, probably wondering why this young executive's voice had sounded so familiar. The first sign that my parents were beginning to panic came exactly 48 hours after the board presentation, in the form of a carefully worded email that landed in my Blackstone inbox at 6:47 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. The sender was Harrison Ashford, and the subject line read, "Partnership Opportunity, Ashford Strategic Consulting." I stared at the screen for a long moment, coffee growing cold in my hands, marveling at the audacity. My father was trying to pitch a collaboration with the executive, who had just publicly demonstrated why his services were becoming obsolete. The email itself was a masterpiece of corporate desperation dressed up as professional opportunity. "Dear Ms. Kane, I was impressed by your presentation on AI integration strategies. Ashford Strategic Consulting would be interested in exploring how our organizational change management expertise might complement your technological initiatives. Perhaps we could schedule a meeting to discuss potential synergies?" Synergies, complement, partnership opportunity. All the buzzwords of a consulting firm that had suddenly realized they were staring down the barrel of irrelevance and was scrambling to find a way to attach themselves to the very innovation they'd been dismissing for years. I forwarded the email to Elena with a brief note, "FYI, unsolicited partnership proposal from yesterday's stakeholder meeting." Her response came back within minutes. "Interesting timing. Let's discuss at our 10 a.m. But the email was just the beginning. Over the next week, the desperation escalated in ways that would have been entertaining if they hadn't been so pathetically transparent. Harrison started showing up at Blackstone's lobby, claiming he had, quote, follow-up meetings that didn't exist, hoping to run into Elena or other executives who might give him insight into the contract renewal process. Security had to escort him out twice when he tried to access floors without proper clearance. Cordelia took a different approach, reaching out to every mutual contact she could find, former clients, industry colleagues, even Rachel's boss at the nonprofit where she worked, trying to gather intelligence about the mysterious Ms. Kane, who seemed to have Elena Vasquez's ear. She was fishing for information, trying to understand who this threat was and how to neutralize it. What they didn't realize was that their increasingly frantic behavior was being reported back to me through Blackstone's extensive professional network. Elena made sure I knew about every inquiry, every attempt to gather information, every desperate maneuver they made to try to salvage their position. "Your parents are making quite the impression," Elena told me during our weekly strategy meeting. Harrison called my assistant 4 times yesterday, trying to schedule an urgent consultation about organizational readiness for technological change. Apparently, Ashford Strategic has suddenly discovered a passion for innovation. The irony was delicious. For 3 years, they'd been advising Blackstone to avoid technological investments. Now, faced with the prospect of losing their most lucrative contract, they were desperately trying to reinvent themselves as tech-forward consultants. But their most spectacular miscalculation came the following Tuesday, when Cordelia made a move that revealed just how little she understood about the new power dynamics at play. I was working late in my office, reviewing implementation timelines for our first AI pilot program, when my assistant knocked on my door. "Miss Kane? There's a woman here claiming she has an appointment with you. She says it's about the Ashford Strategic account." My mother walked into my office wearing her most expensive suit and her most practiced smile, carrying herself with the confident air of someone who was used to having meetings go her way. She'd clearly done her homework. She knew I was the point person for the AI integration project. She knew I had Elena's trust, and she'd decided that a direct appeal might succeed where Harrison's ham-fisted approaches had failed. What she hadn't done was look closely enough at the nameplate on my desk, or pay attention to the family photos I'd strategically placed where any observant visitor would notice them. Pictures of me with my grandmother Kane, the woman whose maiden name I'd adopted after they'd disowned me. "Miss Kane," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk with practiced ease, "thank you for agreeing to see me. I know your time is valuable." I leaned back in my chair, studying her face in the soft light of my office lamps. 6 months ago, this woman had told me I was a liability she couldn't afford. Now she was sitting in my office, asking for my professional favor, completely unaware that she was negotiating with the daughter she'd abandoned. "Mrs. Ashford," I said carefully, "what can I do for you?" I wanted to discuss how Ashford Strategic Consulting might contribute to Blackstone's technological transformation, she began, launching into what was clearly a rehearsed pitch. "We've been in this industry for 15 years, and we understand that adaptation is crucial for survival. We're prepared to invest in AI training for our consultants, to partner with technology firms, to completely restructure our approach if necessary." She paused, leaning forward slightly, her voice taking on a more intimate tone. "Between you and me, Ms. Kane, I think there might have been some miscommunication about our position on technological innovation. We're not opposed to change, we just believe in careful strategic implementation." The backtracking was stunning in its completeness. 3 years of documented resistance to technological investment, suddenly reframed as careful strategic implementation. It was gaslighting on a corporate scale, the same technique she'd used throughout my childhood when confronted with the contradictions in her behavior. "That's interesting," I said neutrally. "Your previous reports to Blackstone consistently recommended against AI investments, describing them as unnecessary expenses." A flicker of something, irritation, fear, crossed her features before the professional mask snapped back into place. "Business landscapes evolve, Ms. Kane. Smart consultants evolve with them." "Indeed they do." I opened my laptop and pulled up one of their recent reports, turning the screen so she could see it. This recommendation, from just 6 months ago, specifically advised Blackstone to focus on proven operational methods rather than pursuing costly technological experiments. Would you characterize that as evolutionary thinking? The color drained from her face as she recognized her own words, her own signature at the bottom of the document. For the first time in the conversation, she looked genuinely rattled. That was before we fully understood the potential applications," she stammered. "The landscape has changed rapidly. We've since recognized the strategic value of technological integration." "The landscape changed," I repeated slowly, "or your contract renewal date approached?" The silence that followed was deafening. I watched my mother's face cycle through a range of emotions: surprise, anger, fear, and finally, a calculating assessment that I recognized from years of childhood negotiations. She was trying to determine whether this young executive was simply well-prepared or actively hostile to her firm. "Ms. Kane," she said finally, her voice taking on a harder edge, "I'm not sure what you're implying, but Ashford Strategic Consulting has always prioritized our clients' best interests. If there have been misunderstandings about our position on technological innovation, we're prepared to clarify our stance through our work, not our words." It was a pivot I'd seen 1,000 times. When caught in an inconsistency, attack the questioner's motives rather than address the contradiction. Classic Cordelia Ashford maneuvering. "I appreciate your flexibility," I said, closing the laptop with a soft click. "However, Blackstone's technological transformation requires consultants with demonstrated expertise in AI implementation, not just willingness to learn. We need partners who've been thinking about these challenges for years, not months." The dismissal was polite but absolute, and we both knew it. She sat there for a moment, probably calculating whether to push harder or retreat gracefully. Experience won out. She gathered her purse and stood with as much dignity as she could muster. "Of course," she said, extending her hand for a professional handshake. "If your needs change, please don't hesitate to contact us. Ashford Strategic Consulting values its relationship with Blackstone Industries." I shook her hand, my own mother's hand, and looked directly into her eyes. For just a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition, some subconscious awareness that this stranger's voice and mannerisms felt familiar. But the moment passed and she was already turning toward the door. "Mrs. Ashford," I called out as she reached for the handle. She turned back, hope flickering across her features. "Good luck with the evolution," I said. After she left, I sat in my office for a long time, staring at the door she'd walked through. The woman who had raised me, who had taught me to be strategic and professional and calculating, had just tried to manipulate me into saving her business, and she hadn't even recognized that she was talking to her own daughter. It was the perfect metaphor for our entire relationship. She had never really seen me at all. The turning point came 3 weeks later, not in a boardroom or corporate office, but at the most unlikely venue imaginable, the annual Millhaven Business Excellence Awards dinner. It was one of those mandatory networking events that every major company in the region attended, where executives in expensive suits made small talk over rubber chicken, while pretending the evening was about honoring achievement rather than displaying corporate status. Elena had insisted I attend as Blackstone's representative for our AI Innovation Award nomination. "You built the program," she'd said. "You should be the one to accept recognition if we win." I'd agreed reluctantly, viewing it as just another professional obligation, not realizing that this particular evening would become the moment when all my careful strategic maneuvering would explode into public spectacle. The event was held at the Millhaven Grand Hotel, a renovated Art Deco building that the city used for occasions requiring sufficient gravitas to impress out-of-town business leaders. The ballroom was filled with round tables draped in white linen, each seating 8 representatives from the region's most influential companies. Corporate logos projected onto the walls. A stage where local politicians and business leaders would deliver speeches about economic development and innovation leadership. I arrived fashionably late, wearing a midnight blue dress that had cost more than my monthly rent 6 months earlier, my hair arranged in the kind of sophisticated updo that whispered expensive salon rather than shouting new money. The transformation from couch-surfing startup failure to senior executive was complete enough that I moved through the crowd with genuine confidence rather than the desperate fake-it-till-you-make-it energy that had sustained me through those early weeks at Blackstone. The Blackstone table was near the front of the room, positioned to reflect our status as one of the evening's major sponsors. I took my assigned seat between Elena and our Chief Financial Officer, Marcus Webb, scanning the room with professional interest while making polite conversation about quarterly projections and market forecasts. That's when I spotted them. Harrison and Cordelia were seated at table 12, about halfway back in the ballroom, representing Ashford Strategic Consulting among the evening's invited small business leaders. They looked exactly as they always did at these events, perfectly groomed, expensively dressed, radiating the kind of confident superiority that came from 15 years of being recognized as among the region's most successful consultants. What they didn't look like was a couple whose most important client was actively planning to terminate their contract in favor of technological solutions that made their services obsolete. I watched them work the room during the cocktail hour, moving from table to table with practiced ease, shaking hands and making small talk with the kind of networking efficiency that had built their reputation. They were still playing the game as if they held the same cards they'd held for the past decade, completely unaware that the rules had changed. The evening's program began with dinner, followed by the usual series of speeches about economic development and regional cooperation. I half-listened while mentally reviewing my acceptance speech, assuming our AI Innovation Award was a foregone conclusion, given the industry attention our pilot program had been receiving. Then came the moment that changed everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the evening's host, a local television personality whose enthusiasm seemed genuine despite the corporate setting. "We're honored to have with us tonight Elena Vasquez, CEO of Blackstone Industries, who will be presenting our Innovation Leadership Award." Elena rose from our table and walked to the podium with the kind of commanding presence that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. She was a natural performer, comfortable with attention and skilled at using it strategically. "Thank you," she began, her voice carrying easily to the back of the ballroom. "Innovation isn't just about having good ideas. It's about having the courage to implement them, even when conventional wisdom suggests they won't work. It's about recognizing talent that others have overlooked and giving brilliant people the resources they need to transform entire industries." She paused, letting her words settle over the audience. This year's Innovation Leadership Award goes to someone who embodies that kind of transformational thinking. Someone who took artificial intelligence from academic theory to practical business application. Someone who's saving Blackstone Industries millions of dollars annually while positioning us at the forefront of technological advancement. My heart started racing. This wasn't the standard corporate award presentation I'd been expecting. The winner of this year's Innovation Leadership Award is Vivienne Kane, Director of Artificial Intelligence at Blackstone Industries. The applause started immediately, but Elena wasn't finished. "What makes this recognition particularly meaningful," she continued, her voice taking on a more personal tone, "is that Ms. Kane's achievements come after overcoming significant personal and professional challenges. She's an entrepreneur who built a groundbreaking technology company that was ahead of its time, and when that venture faced market difficulties, she had the resilience to rebuild her career from the ground up." I stood slowly, my legs feeling unsteady, realizing that Elena was going off script in a way that felt deliberate and dangerous. "Some people," Elena said, her eyes finding my parents' table in the crowd, "mistake temporary setbacks for permanent failure. They judge potential by past performance rather than future possibility. Ms. Kane's success at Blackstone proves that sometimes the people who write you off are the ones who understand you least." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I saw the exact moment when recognition dawned on my parents' faces. Cordelia's hand went to her throat, her face draining of color. Harrison's mouth opened slightly, his expression cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been horror. I walked to the podium in a silence that felt charged with electricity, accepting the Crystal Award from Elena, while the room erupted in applause that sounded distant and surreal. Standing behind the microphone, looking out over an audience of Millhaven's business elite, I could see my parents' table with perfect clarity. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady despite the way my heart was hammering against my ribs. "This recognition belongs not just to me, but to everyone at Blackstone who was willing to bet on innovation over convention, on potential over pedigree." I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the audience before settling briefly on table 12. I grew up believing that family was about unconditional support, that success was about lifting each other up, that love meant standing by each other through difficult times. Another pause, longer this time. I've learned that real family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by who believes in you, when believing in you costs them something. The applause when I finished was thunderous, but all I could focus on was the way my mother was gripping her napkin like a lifeline, and the way my father was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between shock and fear and grudging recognition. After the ceremony, as guests moved into the hotel's reception area for after-dinner networking, the whispers started immediately. The Millhaven business community was small enough that everyone knew everyone's stories, and the revelation that Vivienne Kane was actually Vivienne Ashford, the daughter that Harrison and Cordelia had been publicly dismissing as a failure, spread through the crowd like wildfire. I watched from across the room as people approached my parents with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed schadenfreude. The couple who had spent months explaining their daughter's financial irresponsibility to anyone who would listen were now being asked pointed questions about their relationship with Blackstone's rising star. "Fascinating speech," said David Morrison, CEO of Meridian Financial, when he found me near the bar. "I had no idea you were Harrison and Cordelia's daughter. They've been quite vocal about their disappointment in your career choices." "People sometimes form opinions based on incomplete information," I replied diplomatically, though we both knew exactly what he was really asking. "Indeed," he said, his smile sharp with understanding. "I imagine their perspective on your career trajectory has evolved significantly tonight." Similar conversations happened throughout the evening. Business leaders who had heard my parents' version of my story were now connecting those conversations to the woman who had just been recognized for revolutionary innovation by one of the region's most respected CEOs. The narrative was shifting in real time, and there was nothing Harrison and Cordelia could do to control it. By the end of the evening, it was clear that the Millhaven business community understood exactly what had happened. The daughter who had been publicly branded a failure had become more successful than the parents who had disowned her, and those parents were now professionally dependent on the company where she held significant influence. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, and in a community where reputation was everything, that kind of public reversal was devastating. As I finally made my way toward the exit, Elena caught up with me in the lobby. "That was quite a performance," she said, her expression unreadable. "Yours or mine?" "Both," she admitted, "though I think yours will have longer-lasting effects." She was right. By the time the local business journal published their recap of the evening 3 days later, the story wasn't just about Blackstone's AI Innovation Award. It was about the dramatic revelation that had redefined one of Millhaven's most prominent business families, and everyone in the region's corporate community was talking about it. The counterattack came exactly 72 hours after the awards dinner, and it was more vicious than I had anticipated. My parents, faced with the complete collapse of their professional reputation and the imminent loss of their most lucrative contract, decided that if they were going down, they would take me with them. It started with a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to destroy my credibility before I could destroy theirs completely. Harrison, calling in every favor he'd accumulated over 15 years in the consulting business, reached out to his network of corporate contacts with a story that was both devastating and plausible. Their daughter was mentally unstable, vindictive, and using her position at Blackstone to settle personal scores rather than make sound business decisions. The first call came to Elena directly from Richard Sterling, CEO of Paramount Industries and one of Harrison's oldest clients. I was sitting in Elena's office reviewing quarterly projections when her assistant buzzed through with what she described as an urgent and confidential matter regarding personnel concerns. Elena took the call on speaker, her expression growing darker with each word. "Elena, I'm calling as a friend." Sterling's voice carried the gravity of someone delivering bad news. "I've received some disturbing information about one of your executives that I felt obligated to share. Harrison Ashford contacted me yesterday with serious concerns about your AI director, Vivienne Kane." "What kind of concerns?" Elena's voice was carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. According to Harrison, Ms. Kane is actually his daughter, and she's been using her position to sabotage Ashford's strategic consulting out of spite. He claims she's emotionally unstable, has a history of business failures that she blames on others, and is now leveraging her corporate access to settle personal grievances. The silence that followed felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. Elena's eyes met mine across her desk, and I saw something I'd never seen there before. The faintest flicker of doubt. "Richard," Elena said finally, "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. Can you tell me what specific evidence Harrison provided to support these claims?" He mentioned her startup failure, said it was due to poor judgment and financial irresponsibility rather than market conditions. He also provided documentation showing a pattern of vindictive behavior toward family members who tried to help her. Elena, he seemed genuinely concerned that she might be using Blackstone resources to pursue personal vendettas. After Elena ended the call, we sat in silence for several minutes. I could practically see her recalculating everything she thought she knew about me, wondering if the brilliant AI director she'd hired was actually an unstable young woman using corporate power to settle family scores. "Is any of it true?" she asked finally. "Which part?" I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "That I'm their daughter? Yes. That I failed at my startup? Yes. That I'm using my position here to demonstrate their professional irrelevance? Absolutely." Elena leaned back in her chair, studying my face with the kind of calculating assessment that had made her one of the most successful CEOs in the region. "And the part about vindictive behavior and emotional instability?" "Elena," I said, meeting her gaze directly, "you've worked with me for 6 months. You've seen my work, my judgment, my strategic thinking. Have I given you any reason to question my professional competence or emotional stability?" She considered this for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "But I've also never had employees whose family members felt compelled to warn me about their mental health." The doubt in her voice was subtle but unmistakable, and I realized that my parents had chosen their weapon carefully. They couldn't attack my professional qualifications. Those were too well documented and visible. But they could attack my motives, suggesting that my success at Blackstone was motivated by revenge rather than genuine business acumen. Over the next week, the campaign escalated. Harrison and Cordelia reached out to every mutual contact they could find. Industry colleagues, former Blackstone partners, even vendors who worked with both our companies, spreading their narrative about their emotionally disturbed daughter, who was abusing her corporate position to settle personal scores. The whispers started small but grew louder. During a client meeting, I noticed the way the purchasing director from Meridian Financial looked at me, with a mixture of curiosity and wariness that suggested he'd heard stories about the unstable executive at Blackstone. At a technology conference, conversations would pause when I approached, resuming in lower tones after I passed. Most damaging was when their campaign reached Blackstone's board of directors. 3 board members approached Elena privately with concerns about whether the company was exposing itself to liability by employing someone with documented family conflicts in a position where she could make decisions affecting her relatives' business interests. The pressure culminated in a formal complaint filed with Blackstone's Human Resources Department, alleging conflict of interest and unprofessional conduct. The complaint, signed by Harrison Ashford on behalf of Ashford Strategic Consulting, claimed that I had violated corporate ethics policies by using my position to harm a vendor relationship for personal reasons. Elena called me into her office the day the complaint was filed, and her expression was grim. "Vivienne, we need to address this formally," she said, sliding a copy of the complaint across her desk. "HR is requiring a full investigation, and the board is asking questions about your objectivity regarding Ashford Strategic Consulting." I read through the document, marveling at the legal precision of the language. My parents had clearly hired an attorney to craft their accusations, turning my professional success into evidence of personal vindictiveness. They claimed that my AI integration proposal was specifically designed to eliminate their consulting services, that my recommendations against their contract renewal were based on family grievances rather than business merit, and that my presence at Blackstone created an untenable conflict of interest. "They're not wrong about my motivations being personal," I said finally, "but they're completely wrong about my recommendations being unprofessional." Elena's eyebrows rose slightly. "Explain." "Everything I've told you about Ashford Strategic Consulting's limitations is documented and verifiable. Their resistance to technological innovation, their outdated methodologies, their failure to understand modern business challenges, none of that changes because they happen to be my parents." I leaned forward, choosing my words carefully. "Elena, if another consulting firm had the same track record and the same limitations, would you hesitate to terminate their contract?" "No," she admitted. "Then the question isn't whether my judgment is compromised by personal feelings. The question is whether their accusations are causing you to doubt conclusions that you would accept from any other executive." Elena was quiet for several minutes, staring out her office windows at the city skyline. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the kind of resolve that had made her legendary in corporate circles. "You're right," she said. "And I'm tired of being manipulated by people who think family drama trumps business reality." 2 hours later, Elena called an emergency meeting of Blackstone's executive team and board of directors. She presented a comprehensive review of Ashford Strategic Consulting's performance over the past 3 years, comparing their recommendations to actual business outcomes and highlighting the disconnect between their advice and the company's strategic needs. Then she presented my AI integration proposal alongside detailed financial projections, showing the measurable benefits we'd already achieved in our pilot programs. The contrast was stark. Traditional consulting that had provided minimal value versus technological innovation that was revolutionizing operations and generating significant cost savings. "The question before us," Elena told the assembled executives, "is whether we're going to make business decisions based on merit or allow ourselves to be swayed by personal accusations from a vendor who's facing contract termination." The board's vote was unanimous. Ashford Strategic Consulting's contract would not be renewed, and any future decisions regarding consulting partnerships would be based solely on business merit and strategic alignment. But Elena wasn't finished. She also announced that the company would be issuing a formal response to Harrison Ashford's ethics complaint, documenting the business rationale behind every decision related to his firm, and making it clear that any future attempts to use personal relationships to influence corporate decisions would be met with legal action. When the meeting ended, I realized that my parents' desperate gambit had backfired spectacularly. Instead of destroying my credibility, they had forced Elena to publicly defend my work and formally document their professional inadequacies. Instead of creating doubt about my judgment, they had demonstrated the difference between emotional manipulation and strategic thinking. Their final weapon, the nuclear option of family loyalty and personal attacks, had exploded in their faces, leaving them with no remaining options and no remaining credibility. The war was essentially over, but the most satisfying moment was still to come. The final meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 8 months after I'd been hired, and 6 months after I'd learned that my parents were Blackstone's consulting vendors. Elena had arranged it as the formal contract termination meeting, but I knew it would be something much more significant, the moment when years of conditional love and professional manipulation would finally meet their inevitable conclusion. The setting was Blackstone's main conference room, the same space where I'd first presented my AI integration proposal and unknowingly demonstrated my parents' obsolescence to a room full of executives. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast everything in sharp relief, appropriate for a meeting that would eliminate any remaining ambiguity about who held power in our relationship. Harrison and Cordelia arrived at precisely 9 a.m., accompanied by their attorney, a sharp-featured woman in an expensive suit who looked like she specialized in desperate causes. They were dressed for battle, carrying briefcases and wearing expressions of grim determination. They still believed, even after everything that had happened, that they could somehow salvage their position through legal maneuvering and corporate politics. Elena was already seated at the head of the table when they arrived, flanked by Blackstone's general counsel and head of procurement. I took my place at Elena's right hand, wearing a charcoal gray suit that I'd bought with my first Blackstone paycheck and a confidence that no amount of money could purchase. "Thank you for coming," Elena began, her voice carrying the kind of professional courtesy that barely masked underlying steel. "I want to address the status of Ashford Strategic Consulting's contract with Blackstone Industries, as well as the recent allegations that have been brought to our attention." She opened the folder in front of her and pulled out a document that I recognized as the formal contract termination notice. "After careful review of your firm's performance over the past 3 years, Blackstone Industries has decided not to renew our consulting agreement. This decision is based solely on business considerations and strategic alignment." Harrison leaned forward, his face flushing with the kind of anger I remembered from childhood confrontations. "Elena, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about our firm's capabilities and value proposition. We've provided consistent, reliable consulting services for 3 years, and our recommendations have been sound and professionally executed." "Have they?" Elena's voice remained neutral, but she pulled out another document, a comprehensive analysis of Ashford Strategic's recommendations compared to actual business outcomes. "This review shows that 73% of your strategic recommendations were either ignored by our executive team or actively worked against our company's interests." She slid copies of the analysis across the table to Harrison and his attorney. "Your firm consistently advised against technological investments that have proven highly profitable. You recommended organizational structures that would have reduced our operational efficiency. You discouraged innovation initiatives that are now generating millions in revenue." Cordelia spoke for the first time, her voice carrying that familiar tone of injured dignity that had always been her go-to response when confronted with uncomfortable facts. "Elena, I think you're allowing personal considerations to cloud your professional judgment. It's obvious that our family situation with Vivienne has created an environment where objective evaluation of our work is impossible." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that had always accompanied my mother's ability to reframe her failures as other people's problems. But this time, instead of the childhood helplessness I'd once felt, there was only a cold clarity about what needed to happen next. Elena's smile was sharp as a blade. "Mrs. Ashford, I'm glad you brought that up, because I want to be absolutely clear about the timeline here." She pulled out another document, the formal complaint that Harrison had filed against me. "Your firm filed ethics violations against Ms. Kane on September 15th, claiming that her family relationship compromised her professional judgment regarding your contract." She paused, letting the date sink in. "However, the decision to terminate your contract was made on August 3rd, 6 weeks before you filed your complaint. The rationale for that decision was documented in our quarterly strategic review, which cited your firm's resistance to technological innovation and failure to provide actionable recommendations for our evolving business needs." Harrison's attorney leaned forward, clearly trying to regain control of the narrative. "Ms. Vasquez, while the timeline is noted, it doesn't address the fundamental conflict of interest inherent in having Ms. Kane involved in decisions affecting her family member's business relationship with your company." Elena's expression turned genuinely amused. "You're absolutely right about the conflict of interest, but I think you've misidentified where that conflict lies." She turned to face my parents directly. "For the past 6 months, you've been using your consulting relationship with Blackstone to gather intelligence about Ms. Kane's position, attempting to leverage corporate access to influence family dynamics. You've used client dinners to spread negative information about your daughter's professional competence. You've contacted our board members with personal grievances disguised as business concerns." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Elena's voice remained professionally pleasant, but there was an underlying menace that made everyone sit up straighter. The conflict of interest isn't that Ms. Kane recommended terminating an underperforming vendor who happens to be her family. The conflict of interest is that you attempted to use your vendor relationship to control and manipulate your daughter's career. She leaned back in her chair, her smile turning predatory. That stops today. Harrison's face had gone from red to pale, but he wasn't finished fighting. Elena, you're making a serious mistake. Ashford Strategic Consulting has relationships throughout this industry. Word will get out about how Blackstone treats its consulting partners, and I guarantee it won't reflect well on your company's reputation. It was a threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable. The same kind of emotional blackmail they'd used on me throughout my childhood, now directed at Elena with the assumption that fear of professional consequences would make her reconsider. Elena's laugh was genuine and deeply unsympathetic. Mr. Ashford, are you threatening to damage Blackstone's reputation because we terminated your contract for poor performance? I'm simply pointing out that business relationships are built on trust and mutual respect, Harrison said, though his voice had lost some of its conviction. Indeed they are, Elena agreed, which is why I've already reached out to several of your other clients to discuss your professional conduct during this termination process. It turns out that using family relationships to pressure business decisions isn't well regarded in corporate circles. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched my parents absorb the implications of what Elena had just said, that their reputation in the business community, already damaged by the revelations at the awards dinner, was now under active assault by one of the region's most influential CEOs. Elena wasn't finished. There's one more matter to address. She pulled out a final document and slid it across the table. This is a formal cease and desist notice regarding your continued attempts to contact Blackstone employees, board members, and business partners with personal grievances. Any future attempts to use professional channels to pursue family disputes will result in legal action. Cordelia's voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. Elena, surely this is unnecessary. We can resolve this misunderstanding without— Mrs. Ashford, Elena interrupted, her tone finally losing all pretense of professional courtesy. There is no misunderstanding. You chose to treat your daughter as a business asset when she was successful, and a liability when she wasn't. You chose to weaponize professional relationships to control personal dynamics. You chose to attack her credibility when you couldn't control her decisions. She stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. Those choices have consequences. Your contract is terminated, effective immediately. Your final payment will be processed according to the terms of our agreement. Any property belonging to Blackstone Industries will be returned within 48 hours. As my parents gathered their things with as much dignity as they could muster, Elena delivered the final blow. One last thing, she said as they reached the door. Miss Kane will be taking over the organizational efficiency portfolio that your firm previously handled. Given her demonstrated success with technological integration and strategic planning, we're confident she'll provide the innovative thinking that your firm was unable to deliver. The irony was perfect. The daughter they'd dismissed as a failure would now be doing the work they'd considered themselves uniquely qualified to perform. After they left, Elena and I sat in the conference room for several minutes, processing what had just happened. Through the windows, I could see my parents walking across the parking lot toward their car, their body language reflecting the complete devastation of everything they'd built over the past 15 years. How do you feel? Elena asked finally. I considered the question carefully. I'd expected to feel triumphant, vindicated, maybe even vindictive. Instead, what I felt was something quieter but more profound. Closure. Free, I said finally. For the first time in my life, completely free. Elena nodded approvingly. Good. Because we have work to do, and I need executives who aren't carrying emotional baggage that interferes with their judgment. As we walked back to our offices, I realized that this morning hadn't just been about terminating a consulting contract or settling family scores. It had been about establishing a new order, where merit mattered more than family loyalty, where professional competence trumped emotional manipulation, and where the daughter who'd been trained to enhance her parents' success had finally grown powerful enough to define her own. The war was over, and I had won more completely than I'd ever imagined possible. 1 year later, I stood in the office that had once seemed impossibly grand, 32 floors above the city of Millhaven, with windows that overlooked everything I'd once thought was beyond my reach. But the view looked different now, not because the skyline had changed, but because I was no longer the desperate young woman who'd first walked into this building carrying nothing but determination and a grandmother's maiden name. The nameplate on my desk read Vivienne Kane, Chief Innovation Officer, a promotion that had come 6 months after my parents' contract termination, when Elena decided that my strategic thinking deserved a position that matched my impact on the company. The salary that came with the new title was more money than my parents had ever made in their best year, but what mattered more was the recognition that I'd built something meaningful from the wreckage of my previous life. The AI integration program I'd developed was now being studied by business schools as a case study in successful technological transformation. Companies across the region were hiring consultants specifically to replicate what we'd accomplished at Blackstone. The same innovation that my parents had dismissed as expensive distractions from core business competencies was revolutionizing how entire industries approached efficiency and customer service. But success, I'd learned, was more complicated than the simple narrative of triumph over adversity that people loved to tell. It wasn't just about proving wrong the people who'd counted you out, though there was certainly satisfaction in that. It was about discovering who you were when you stopped trying to earn love that was never freely given in the first place. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Even after the contract termination meeting, even after Elena's public vindication of my work, I'd struggled with the emotional aftermath of cutting ties with my parents completely. There were moments, usually late at night when the office was empty and the city lights blurred through rain-streaked windows, when I wondered if I'd become the kind of person who destroyed families for professional advancement. But then I would remember the years of conditional affection, the way they'd weaponized their love to control my choices, the casual cruelty of being discarded the moment I stopped enhancing their social status. I would remember sleeping on Rachel's couch and counting dollars at the grocery store while they told their friends I was an embarrassment to the family name. Most importantly, I would remember that I hadn't destroyed our family. I had simply refused to continue pretending that what we'd had was actually love. The industry attention that followed my success at Blackstone had been both gratifying and overwhelming. Harvard Business Review featured our AI implementation in a cover story about the new corporate leadership. Forbes included me in their 30 under 30 inches list for technology innovation. The same business journals that had once ignored Neuralink solutions now wanted exclusive interviews about my comeback story. But the most meaningful recognition came from unexpected sources. Rachel, who'd moved to Seattle for a promotion at a tech nonprofit, sent me a card that simply said, "I always knew you'd figure it out." Former employees from Neuralink reached out to congratulate me and share how the failure of our startup had taught them valuable lessons about resilience. Elena's sister, who ran a women's entrepreneurship organization, invited me to speak at conferences about overcoming family rejection to build professional success. Each of these connections reminded me that real relationships, the kind built on mutual respect rather than conditional approval, were far more valuable than the family bonds I'd spent years trying to repair. The most surprising development had been the emergence of a chosen family that I hadn't seen coming. Elena had become not just a mentor but a genuine friend, someone whose tough love came without strings attached. Marcus Webb, our CFO, had become a trusted advisor who helped me navigate corporate politics without losing my integrity. Even Diana Torres, the HR director who'd first called me about the position, had become someone I could count on for honest feedback and professional guidance. These relationships taught me something my parents never had, that respect given freely was infinitely more valuable than approval earned through performance. 6 months after the contract termination, I'd learned through industry contacts that Ashford Strategic Consulting had quietly dissolved. Harrison and Cordelia had been unable to rebuild their reputation after the very public revelation of their professional limitations and personal vindictiveness. Their other clients, apparently influenced by Elena's conversations about their conduct, had gradually terminated their relationships with the firm. The last I'd heard, they'd moved to a smaller city in Indiana where Harrison had taken a corporate position and Cordelia was working part-time for a local nonprofit. They'd gone from being prominent figures in Millhaven's business community to being ordinary middle-aged professionals, starting over in a place where no one knew their story. I felt no satisfaction in their downfall, but I felt no guilt either. They had made their choices, to tie their love to my achievements, to abandon me when those achievements didn't meet their standards, to weaponize professional relationships to control personal dynamics. The consequences of those choices belonged to them. What I'd gained was something far more valuable than revenge, the understanding that my worth wasn't determined by their approval or anyone else's. The daughter they'd raised to seek external validation had finally learned to trust her own judgment, to value her own achievements, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than transactional benefit. Now, standing in my corner office with its view of a city that had become truly home, I thought about the young woman who'd stepped off that Greyhound bus 18 months earlier. She'd been broken, desperate, carrying everything she owned in 2 suitcases, and convinced that her worth was measured by other people's opinions of her success. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the best revenge against people who try to diminish you isn't destroying them. It's becoming so successful that their opinions become irrelevant. But this story isn't really about my parents or even about corporate success. It's about the moment when you stop asking, "Why don't they love me?" and start asking, "Do I love myself enough to walk away from people who make love conditional?" It's about recognizing that family isn't always the people who share your DNA. Sometimes it's the people who see your potential when you've forgotten it yourself, who believe in your vision when it seems impossible, who celebrate your success without demanding credit for it. Most importantly, it's about understanding that the people who write you off during your lowest moments are telling you exactly who they are, and believing them the first time. So here's my question for you. Have you ever been in a situation where choosing yourself meant disappointing people who claimed to love you? Have you ever had to choose between staying loyal to people who treated love like a business transaction and building relationships based on genuine respect? Because if you have, I want you to know that walking away from conditional love isn't betrayal, it's self-preservation. The people who truly care about you will support your growth, even when it's inconvenient for them. The people who don't will reveal themselves through their actions when your success no longer serves their purposes. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like you were performing for love that should have been freely given, drop a comment below and share your experience. Let's build a community of people who understand that family is about who shows up for you, not who shares your last name. And if you found value in this story, don't forget to subscribe for more content about building success on your own terms, creating boundaries with toxic family members, and discovering that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for the best thing that ever will. Because here's what I learned. The daughter who was thrown away for being financially irresponsible became the executive who could afford to buy and sell the people who discarded her. But more importantly, she became someone who didn't need their approval to know her own worth. Remember, you don't owe anyone a relationship that costs you your peace, your growth, or your self-respect. Not even family, especially not family. Stay strong, choose yourself, and never apologize for becoming everything they said you couldn't be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.